far beyond the reach of any human telescope, in the silent gulf where stars burned like distant funeral candles. Nolan Grayson drifted through the black. He had traveled these paths 1,000 times before, tracing invisible highways carved by Viltrumite instinct, following the pull of gravity and memory back toward a home that had long since stopped feeling like one. The journey should have been routine. Instead, the void trembled. It began as a shimmer at the edge of his vision, a thread of light woven through nothing. Then the sky itself split open, an impossible wound in the fabric of reality that swallowed him whole. There was no time to react, no chance to resist. The universe folded, tore, and spat him out somewhere unfamiliar. When his senses returned, he was falling toward a blue world that looked achingly like Earth, yet felt subtly wrong. The atmosphere carried different frequencies. The satellites hummed with unfamiliar signatures. The cultural noise rising from the surface was louder, hungrier, and strangely theatrical. He slowed his descent above the cloud line and simply watched. The cities below were monuments to something he did not immediately understand. Skyscrapers wore the faces of costumed men and women, their smiles enormous, their teeth impossibly white. Broadcasts poured through the airwaves like scripture, and every screen worshipped a figure draped in red, white, and blue. Nolan had seen empires before. He had helped build them, but this was something stranger. This was reverence sold by the hour. He watched a rescue unfold in a coastal city. A costumed woman lifted a child from rubble, then paused, adjusting her posture until the cameras found the correct angle. Beyond the frame, 3 other survivors remained trapped. She did not turn toward them. Instead, she waved. The applause was deafening. Nolan's jaw tightened. He had seen worlds die under Viltrumite boots, but he had never seen a civilization willingly kneel before its own reflection. Deep beneath the Vought International Tower, alarms whispered through secured corridors. Analysts stared at satellite imagery showing an object that should not exist, moving faster than their instruments could track. Executives gathered in glass rooms and spoke in the calm tones of people who had long ago decided that every problem was simply a matter of budget. They assumed a rival power. They assumed an experiment. They assumed anything except the truth. Higher, above the clouds, Homelander felt it before he understood it. A pursuer. A presence. Something had entered his sky without permission. He rose slowly, scanning the horizon with eyes that could burn through steel, and found nothing. For a long moment he simply hovered there, jaw clenched, listening to a silence that refused to answer him. Irritation curdled into something colder, curiosity. In a rain-slicked warehouse across the harbor, Billy Butcher lit a cigarette and read the same report 3 times. A drone squadron destroyed in seconds. No wreckage worth salvaging, no signature, no claim of responsibility. The witnesses spoke of a man who moved like a rumor and left without a word. Butcher exhaled smoke through his teeth and muttered something no one else could hear. Every soup he had ever hunted craved attention. This one did not. Nolan chose patience. He watched from the clouds for days, learning the shape of this world's cruelty. Then, one evening, he saw a tenement fire spread across a working-class block. Above it, Homelander hovered, calculating optics, weighing the value of a rescue against the risk of unflattering footage. He turned away. Nolan did not. He moved before thought, tearing through smoke and steel, carrying survivors to safety in blurred arcs no camera could capture cleanly. Hundreds lived who should have died. He vanished into the clouds before the sirens finished arriving. By morning, the internet was aflame. Some called him an angel. Others whispered of aliens. Vought called him a problem. And Homelander, alone above the skyline, stared toward the vanishing horizon with something new flickering behind his eyes. For the first time, another god walked his world, and that god did not fear him. The Vought Tower never slept, but in the days that followed, it burned with a different kind of insomnia. Boardrooms filled and emptied like tides. Analysts chased shadows across satellite feeds. Public relations specialists drafted 17 different narratives, each one more elegant than the last, none of them true. The corporation that had spent half a century manufacturing gods now faced something it could not manufacture, and the silence in its hallways grew heavier by the hour. Their strategy was ancient and reliable. Every powerful being wanted something. Money opened most doors. Fame opened the rest. When both failed, fear finished the negotiation. Executives prepared offers before they even knew the stranger's name, drafting contracts thick enough to bury nations. Private jets waited on quiet runways. Encrypted channels stayed open through the night. Nothing worked. Envoys returned empty-handed, unable to even locate the man they had been sent to bribe. Broadcast invitations went unanswered. Coded signals hidden in international news feeds received no reply. The stranger simply refused to acknowledge that Vought existed. He was not hostile. He was not defiant. He was indifferent. And indifference was a language Vought had never learned to translate. Homelander read the failure reports in private. He read them again. Then he burned them. In the mirror of his penthouse, he practiced expressions that no longer felt natural. Smiles rehearsed so many times they had lost their meaning. He replayed footage of every recorded intervention, searching for weakness, for vanity, for any flaw he could exploit. He found only competence. Rescues performed without cameras. Lives saved without witnesses. Efficiency without ego. Each clip was a quiet accusation, and every frame widened the crack forming behind his eyes. Within the 7, opinions splintered. A-Train dismissed the newcomer as a passing storm. The Deep suggested diplomacy, which everyone ignored. Black Noir watched surveillance footage in silence, then began sharpening blades no one had asked him to prepare. Behind closed doors, some quietly admitted what none would say aloud. This stranger moved in ways their bodies could not. Beneath the city, Billy Butcher stared at a corkboard covered in dead ends. No birth certificate, no compound V trace, no shell company, no mistress. No debts, no leverage. For a man whose entire war depended on finding the thread that unraveled every soup, this absence was its own kind of terror. He drank slowly that night, and for the first time in years he considered the possibility that his enemy might not be his enemy at all. That thought disturbed him more than any monster ever had. Above the streets, Nolan continued to watch. He saw children learning to worship faces printed on lunchboxes. He saw journalists rewarded for silence and punished for honesty. He saw a species that had traded its moral compass for a merchandising deal. His disgust was quiet, but it was deep, and it stirred older instincts he had spent years trying to bury. A part of him, the Viltrumite part, whispered that such a world deserved to be corrected by stronger hands. Another part, the part that had learned mercy through loss, refused to listen. The contradiction defined him now. He despised weakness, yet he had come to understand that domination was simply weakness wearing armor. Then came the bridge. A support column failed during rush hour, and Nolan moved before the concrete finished falling. Cars hung suspended in his grip. Families breathed again. Among the survivors stood Starlight, drawn there by a distress call. She watched him work without ceremony, without pause, without the hunger for recognition she had come to expect from her own kind. When he turned to leave, she spoke, and he answered. Their words were few. His questions cut deeper than any interrogation. That same night, Homelander finally found him above New York. They did not fight. They circled, measured, and spoke. Homelander demanded respect. Nolan simply asked why the people below feared their greatest defender. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but in Homelander's chest, something ancient cracked. The encounter ended without violence. The war, however, had already begun. There are wounds that bleed openly, and there are wounds that bleed inward, poisoning a man from within until he mistakes his own reflection for an enemy. Homelander carried the second kind now. He walked through Vought's corridors with the same practiced smile, shook the same hands, delivered the same rehearsed speeches, but behind his eyes a quiet fever burned. He had been asked a single question, and he could not stop hearing it. He decided the question needed an answer written in fire. The plan was assembled through intermediaries who had learned long ago never to ask why. A shipment of experimental munitions vanished from a Vought subsidiary. A disgruntled contractor received an anonymous wire transfer. Within a week, a manufactured cell of self-styled radicals had been armed, radicalized, and quietly aimed at a downtown financial district during the busiest hour of the afternoon. Homelander told himself it was a controlled demonstration. He told himself the casualties would be minimal. He told himself many things that afternoon. The first explosion tore through a subway platform. The second collapsed the lower floors of a 50-story tower. The third was never supposed to happen at all. Homelander arrived first, cape unfurled against the smoke, cameras already tracking his silhouette. He waited for the stranger to appear, expecting reluctance, expecting negotiation, expecting an audience. Instead, Nolan simply arrived and got to work. He did not acknowledge Homelander. He did not pose. He tore through collapsing floors with surgical precision, carrying children from stairwells, redirecting falling debris with calculated bursts of momentum, sealing ruptured gas lines with hands that moved faster than the eye could follow. Every action served a purpose. Every purpose served a life. Reporters on the ground struggled to keep him in frame, and the world, watching through 1,000 phones, saw something it had never truly seen before, a hero who did not perform. Homelander felt the shift before he understood it. The cameras were drifting. The crowd was pointing elsewhere. He raised his voice, launched into a heat vision demonstration meant to impress, and accidentally cut through a water main that flooded a shelter 3 blocks away. He tried to salvage the moment with a rescue of his own, but his hands trembled and the trembling became visible. Their philosophies stood exposed in the ruins between them. One fought to be admired. The other acted because saving lives was simply expected. The contrast needed no narration. It wrote itself across every screen on Earth. When the last civilian was clear, Homelander finally struck. The blow shattered a rooftop and hurled Nolan through 3 buildings. The world braced for retaliation, for spectacle, for the kind of duel that broke cities. Nolan gave them none of that. He rose from the rubble, glanced at the terrified crowd still fleeing below, and lifted into the sky, drawing Homelander with him by simply refusing to fight on the ground. Homelander followed, screaming, hurling laser and fist and fury, and Nolan absorbed each strike with the patience of a man who had endured worse from stronger enemies. They collided somewhere above the clouds. Shockwaves rolled across the city, rattling windows 100 miles away. For nearly a minute, the sky itself became a battlefield, and satellites captured flashes that governments would classify for decades. Yet Nolan never pressed his advantage. He blocked, redirected, and endured, refusing to let the fight drift back toward the streets below. Then, without warning, he stopped. He looked at Homelander, who was bleeding from the nose for the first time in his adult life, and simply left. No parting word, no victory pose, only distance, growing between them until it became silence. Homelander returned to the ground shaking. On live broadcast, his voice cracked mid-sentence, his smile faltered, his hands would not stop clenching. Millions watched, and something in the carefully constructed mythology of Vought began to crumble in real time. Far below the noise, in a bunker no civilian would ever see, a technician frowned at a monitor. A signal was pulsing from beyond the solar system. Something older than Vought had noticed. Something older than Earth was coming. The city rebuilt itself slowly in the days that followed, and beneath the noise of cranes and press conferences, a quieter story began to unfold. Starlight found Nolan on a rooftop overlooking the harbor, watching gulls trace lazy circles above the water. He did not turn when she landed. He simply spoke, as though he had been waiting for her without knowing it. Their conversations became a ritual over the following nights. She asked careful questions. He gave careful answers. Piece by piece, a picture emerged that she was not prepared to see. He spoke of a homeworld whose skies were the color of iron, of a people who measured worth in conquest, of a childhood spent learning that mercy was a disease weaker civilizations invented to comfort themselves. He spoke of missions across galaxies she could not name, of worlds that had once been green and were no longer worlds at all. He did not brag. He did not confess. He simply described, the way a surgeon describes an old operation, and every sentence carried the weight of things he could not undo. Starlight listened without interrupting. When he finally paused, she asked the only question that mattered. She asked why he had stopped. He was silent for a long time. Then he told her about a son and a fight and a moment when he had held someone he loved and understood. For the first time, what his people had been teaching him to destroy. He did not finish the story. He did not need to. Elsewhere, in a warehouse thick with cigarette smoke, Butcher's team assembled a different portrait. Huey pored over intercepted alien signals. Mother's milk cross-referenced satellite data with ancient astronomical anomalies. Frenchie decoded fragments of a language no human tongue was built to speak. What emerged was not a hero, it was a soldier. A soldier of an empire that had erased civilizations for sport. Butcher stared at the evidence for a long time. Then he laughed, low and bitter, and poured himself another drink. Power always corrupted. He had said it 1,000 times. He said it again now, but the words tasted different. Because this power, for reasons he could not explain, had chosen to stop. Vought moved in the shadows meanwhile, blind to everything but appetite. Their recovery teams had scoured the sites of Nolan's earliest interventions, and in a crushed piece of concrete they had found what they were looking for, a single droplet of dried blood, alien, impossibly dense. Scientists in sealed labs spoke of rewriting Compound V from the ground up. Executives spoke of contracts worth trillions. No one spoke of consequences. Homelander wandered the tower like a ghost of himself. He watched replays of the battle in the sky obsessively, freezing frames, searching for the moment his image had cracked. He found it in his own eyes. He began sleeping less. He began speaking to reflections. His grip on the Seven loosened, and the Seven, sensing weakness, began quietly measuring the distance to the throne. The mysterious probes arrived at the edge of the solar system without fanfare. They did not broadcast. They did not threaten. They simply watched, and their silence was worse than any declaration of war. On the final night before the storm broke, Nolan gathered starlight and, reluctantly, Butcher on a rain-soaked rooftop. He told them the truth without decoration. He had not been sent to save this world. He had never been sent to save any world. He had been sent to prepare planets for occupation, to soften populations, to identify weaknesses that later armies would exploit. Everything he had ever been, until recently, had been a lie dressed as a virtue. Starlight closed her eyes. Butcher said nothing at all. Nolan looked upward towards stars that no longer felt distant and told them what was coming. His people had noticed. His people were near. And this time he would not be preparing the ground for them. He would be standing on it. Panic did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as a silence, spreading across every screen on Earth as governments confirmed what conspiracy forums had whispered for weeks. The lights in the sky were not satellites. They were ships, and the ships were slowing. The first Viltrumite scouts descended through the upper atmosphere without ceremony. There were only 3 of them. 3 was enough. They did not broadcast demands. They did not identify themselves. They simply arrived, and within minutes an entire aircraft carrier group had gone dark in the Pacific. No survivors, no wreckage worth recovering, only water, quietly returning to stillness. The world understood, all at once, that Homelander had never been the ceiling. He had been the floor. Vought responded the only way it knew how. In sealed laboratories beneath the tower, scientists rushed forward with untested Compound V variants. Drawing from the alien residue they had harvested without permission or wisdom, the results were monstrous. Test subjects screamed themselves inside out. Others survived, but survival was the wrong word for what they became. 2 broke containment within hours. 1 leveled a district in Chicago before collapsing into ash. Another vanished into the sewers and was never found. Butcher watched the reports come in and felt something inside him give way. His war had always been simple. Soups were the enemy. Humans were the victims. Vengeance was the currency. But the sky was full of gods now, and the gods he had hated his entire adult life suddenly looked very small. He stood in the doorway of a safe house for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was rough. He told his team that he was going to work with Nolan. He did not soften it. He did not explain. He simply named the choice and walked into the rain. Homelander could not accept what was happening. He had spent his life being told he was the strongest thing that had ever lived, and now the sky was full of things that made him feel like a child in a costume. His pride, wounded and starving, demanded action. He flew to meet the scouts alone, without strategy, without allies, without even a plan beyond proving that he still mattered. The fight lasted less than a minute. He was returned to Earth by the wind, broken in ways his healing could not immediately mend. and left in a crater outside a suburban town where children had once collected his trading cards. He lay there for hours, staring at a sky that had finally refused to belong to him. Nolan fought everywhere at once. He shattered a scout above the Atlantic. He tore another from the sky above Mumbai. He carried civilians from collapsing tunnels in Berlin and returned to the stratosphere before the dust had settled. But the scouts were only the beginning. Behind them, larger ships gathered, and behind those ships the sky grew darker still. Cities burned, allies fell. Starlight held a dying friend in the ruins of a hospital and could not find words that meant anything. She stood afterward on a rooftop and watched refugees flood the highways, and for the first time in her life, she wondered whether hope itself was a resource that could run out. Nolan felt the doubt rise in his own chest. Every world he had ever helped destroy had begun exactly like this: fear, fragmentation, the slow collapse of trust between neighbors. He had been the architect of 100 such collapses. Now he was trying to prevent one, and the effort felt impossibly small against the machinery of the empire that had trained him. He landed on a hillside outside a burning city and, for a long moment, considered leaving, not out of cowardice, out of guilt. He had brought this here. His mere existence had drawn their attention. Perhaps the kindest thing he could do was disappear and let them chase him into the void. Then he saw a child alone on the road below, walking toward the flames, looking for a parent. He stayed. The sky above Earth had become a cathedral of war. Viltrumite warships hung in low orbit like black moons, their hulls scarred by centuries of conquest, their shadows falling across continents. Beneath them, the survivors of humanity gathered in the ruins of what had once been ordinary lives, and against every instinct their history had taught them, they prepared to fight. The alliance that assembled in those final hours would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Military commanders stood beside vigilantes they had once hunted. Supes who had spent decades performing for cameras now stood in silence, stripped of costume and script, learning for the first time what their powers were actually for. Butcher walked among them with a shotgun slung across his back and a grim honesty in his eyes that unsettled even his oldest enemies. Starlight moved between the wounded, offering not speeches but hands, not slogans but presence. And above them all, Nolan Grayson prepared to become something he had never been permitted to be. Not a soldier, not a symbol, a shield. The Viltrumite commander descended alone, as tradition demanded. He was older than Nolan, scarred by wars that predated human civilization, and he wore his contempt like a second skin. He spoke to Nolan in the old tongue, the language of conquest, and reminded him of oaths sworn on worlds that no longer existed. He offered Nolan a final chance to return to his people, to lead the pacification of this planet, to reclaim his place among the stars. Nolan answered in English. He spoke slowly so that the humans watching would understand. He said that strength existed to protect, not to dominate. He said that any empire built on the corpses of the weak was already dying, no matter how bright its banners flew. He said that he had spent his entire life being told that mercy was a weakness, and he had come, at last, to understand that mercy was the only strength worth having. The commander laughed. Then the sky ignited. The battle unfolded across 3 theaters at once. In low orbit, a coalition of hastily armed satellites and salvaged Vought aircraft harassed the Viltrumite warships, buying seconds at the cost of lives. On the ground, enhanced supes and human soldiers held choke points in shattered cities, trading blood for meters. And in the air between, Nolan and the commander waged a duel that shook the atmosphere itself, each blow rearranging weather patterns, each parry drawing thunder from clear skies. Homelander watched the battle from a hilltop for longer than he would ever admit. He was still bleeding from wounds that should have healed. His costume was torn. His hair, always so carefully arranged, hung limp across his forehead. For the first time in his life, no camera was pointed at him. And for the first time in his life, he understood what that silence meant. It meant that whatever he did next would not be for the world. It would be for himself. He rose into the sky and joined the fight. He did not announce it. He did not pose. He simply arrived at Nolan's side and struck a Viltrumite soldier from behind with everything he had. It was not enough to win. It was enough to matter. He fell within minutes, broken and burning, but he fell facing the enemy. And somewhere in the ruins of his ego, a smaller and truer thing finally drew breath. Butcher held a collapsing subway tunnel with a squad of humans and soups he would once have executed. When the wall finally gave, he pulled a stranger from the rubble and carried her 3 blocks through gunfire before collapsing beside her. He was not a hero. He would never be a hero. But he chose, in that moment, to be something better than what his hatred had made him. Starlight became the voice of the resistance without ever meaning to. Broadcasts of her tending to the wounded, speaking softly to terrified children, refusing to abandon the dying, reached every corner of the shrinking free world. Hope, it turned out, was not a resource. It was a decision made again and again by ordinary people in impossible hours. Nolan struck the commander down not with a killing blow, but with a refusal. He disarmed him, forced him to his knees before both armies, and spoke words that carried across every channel the humans had left. He renounced the Empire. He renounced its philosophy. He named himself an exile and named Earth his home. The Viltrumite fleet, faced with a defector who had shamed their creed before their own soldiers, withdrew, not in defeat, in doubt. Doubt, Nolan knew, was how empires began to die. Earth survived, bruised, transformed, awake. The world that emerged from the ashes did not look like the one that had entered them. The Vought tower still stood, but the light in its windows had changed. Investigations began within days, and unlike previous scandals, they did not fade. Decades of buried footage surfaced. Executives who had once dictated policy from private jets now testified before commissions in humbled voices. The mythology that had held the corporation together for generations dissolved not with a single revelation, but with 1,000 small ones, each admitted by people who no longer believed the lies were worth defending. Statues came down quietly. Merchandise went unsold. Children who had once dressed as Homelander for school pageants now asked their parents difficult questions. And their parents, for the first time in a long time, tried to answer honestly. Starlight did not seek the spotlight, and perhaps that was why it found her. She spoke rarely, worked constantly, and refused every offer of leadership that arrived wrapped in cameras. She helped rebuild neighborhoods. She sat with families who had lost everything. When she did speak publicly, her words were plain, and their plainness became their power. She reminded people that heroism was not a costume. It was a habit, chosen daily, often in silence. Butcher survived, though survival wore him thinner than any death would have. He walked with a limp now, and his laugh had lost its edge. He never fully trusted soups, and he never pretended to. But when a young hero asked him years later whether power inevitably corrupted, he thought for a long time before answering. He said that power did not corrupt, character did. Power only revealed what had been there all along. It was the closest thing to peace he ever offered. Homelander did not survive the battle, and history did not soften his memory. His face appeared in documentaries and case studies, in classrooms where children learned to recognize the difference between confidence and cruelty. He became a warning rather than a hero. And the warning was studied not with hatred but with sorrow, because those who examined his life carefully saw a boy who had been raised to be worshipped and never taught how to be loved. Nolan Grayson did not stay. He was offered monuments. He was offered citizenship. He was offered a seat at every negotiating table on Earth. He refused each in turn, gently, without theater. He told Starlight, on their final night, that a world which had just learned to trust itself did not need another god watching over it. He told Butcher, who nodded once and said nothing, that he hoped they would never meet again, and that if they did, it would be as equals. Then he rose into the sky and did not return. Years passed. Earth changed. The technology recovered from the invasion advanced human science by centuries, but the councils that oversaw its use were slow, deliberate, and unglamorous. Ethical review boards became more famous than superheroes. Engineers became household names. The children born in the years after the war grew up hearing stories not of flawless saviors, but of flawed people who had chosen sacrifice when it was easier to choose ego. It was, in its quiet way, the beginning of something better. Far from Earth, in a system whose name no human tongue had learned, Nolan paused above a lonely world of red deserts and blue oceans. He had been drifting for a long time, and drifting suited him. He listened to the silence of space, which had always been a comfort, and found that the silence was no longer silent. A transmission moved through it, faint, ancient, intelligent. It did not belong to his people. It did not belong to any people he knew. It was directed outward in every direction at once, and it carried within it the unmistakable signature of something reaching across realities, not merely across stars. Nolan listened for a long time. Then he turned his face toward the void and understood that his arrival on Earth had not been an accident. Something was gathering champions, something was gathering monsters, and the next war had already begun.